All right. Thank you very much and welcome, everyone. I hope you had a great event and I hope this will be a good end to it. Jonathan, you were talking about like some of the similarities, and I actually caught the end of the previous presentation, and I think I've heard another link, which is this idea of a startup company coming from maybe a little unusual place, right? In your case, in Israel, in our case, in Stockholm, in Sweden, which was definitely not an obvious place for a company to be born that would rival the Silicon Valley companies. And it's fantastic to see that actually the environment is changing, that the market is changing, and that companies from all around the globe now can compete on that market and can do really well. So today I'll try and give you a little bit of an insight into what Spotify is like today, a little bit about how we have been growing recently, a little bit mostly about how we think about ourselves and how we think about our company. But as I've been talking to Jonathan, preparing for this talk a little bit, I already understand that probably most of the things that we found work well for us, you already do. So this presentation and hopefully this talk will be probably most valuable the more you engage. So if you hear something surprising or if you hear something interesting, please ask questions. We'll do a Q&A towards the end. We'll make sure to leave plenty of time for that. But I really hope for that interaction. It's still a bit awkward. I wish I was in your office. It's always nicer, but the circumstances are like this. But maybe that's also an opportunity for us to have that connection. So without further ado, welcome to Spotify. This is what you would see if you entered one of our main offices in Stockholm. You're seeing this and you're probably you're first among some of the Spotifyers that joined in the last 2 years because they have not seen this new office entrance. It's been finished, a refurbishment just before the pandemic. So they wouldn't have seen this nice visualization that sits in our foyer in the reception area of one of our buildings. So you're first to see that among probably at least a good 1,000 of Spotifyers who have joined since we've closed our offices. I'm Marcin Floryan. I'm today at Spotify as a technology operations lead, which means I try to support and improve an organization about 750, close to 1,000 people soon as part of R&D in how we build software. But I've been at Spotify already for 6 years. And in that time, I've had a chance to do a bunch of different jobs, including being a manager for a software development team and being a director for a larger part of the Spotify engineering ecosystem. So just to give you some context of what Spotify is like, where we are, so that you can have a reference for yourselves and also maybe for your ambitions. We've been founded in April 2006, so 15 years ago already. We had a big celebration for 10 years anniversary, but unfortunately not such a big one for 15, with everyone being distributed. We've grown now to about 7,000 employees. Probably above that if you include all the consultants that work with us as well. And we are 3,000 people in technology R&D, right? So that includes all functions like engineering, product, user design, and lots of others. I'll mention some more later. And right now we have 5 global hubs in Stockholm, Gothenburg, London, New York, and Boston. But thinking a little bit and addressing the question that I've heard at the end of the previous talk as well is like, how do we get the next 3,000 people into technology at Spotify? We've decided to introduce something we call work from anywhere. So we started employing people around the globe and are slowly migrating or moving from being a company that is very much co-located and based in Sweden and to some extent in US to being a truly global company in terms of our workforce. So maybe that's something for you to consider as well, because that was the only way for us to continue growing. And when we talk about growth, I think this graph is quite important because it really tells a story of how we've been evolving. This is roughly the number of employees over time, but as I also want to mention some of our business numbers, we're now reaching over 300 million users every month. And 165 of them decide to actually pay us every month, which is fantastic. We managed to reach out 178 markets by now. But when you look at that MAU number, I think it's interesting to also look at how that number has changed. And there is no coincidence that the shape of that graph is roughly similar to the shape of the graph of the number of employees that we have. So our company definitely grows with the people that we're trying to reach and serve our customers. And as you know, we've IPO'd in 2018. It has been an interesting incident. As some of you may quickly notice, the New York Stock Exchange has celebrated Spotify with a Swiss flag. We're not based in Switzerland. Fortunately, they quickly realized their mistake and put up the Swedish flag soon after. But I mentioned this anecdote because it kind of a little bit reflects how we thought about IPO internally. And of course, big congratulations to you and Outbrain for the IPO you did. That's usually a major milestone for a company because it really recognizes the company on the market as having a significant potential and being of interest to investors. But we have really not paid that much attention to our IPO. And I think one of the things that actually signifies our continued growth and evolution is the fact that we have almost ignored the IPO. So the fact that we've IPO'd has changed very little, or we really worked hard for it to change very little in the company. And mostly because our belief is that the success of the company is based on our ability to have a long-term vision and to work towards long-term horizons in terms of our investments, in terms of our strategies, in terms of our thinking. Some of the things that we do and we put in place, they pay off in 5 and 10 years' time. So if we suddenly started really chasing the stock price and trying to create actions and create strategies that will maximize that stock price, I think we would have a harder time reaching our long-term vision. So a little bit about how we're organized. This is usually the reason I end up being invited to talk to a lot of companies. This is a paper that has been published in 2012. Two of the then Agile coaches, Henrik Nyberg and Anders Ivarsson, decided to describe how Spotify was organized back then. And I guess it's going to be no surprise to you that many of the things that have been published in that paper have long gone and disappeared. And actually, this is where this graph comes relevant again. I'm not going to go back to it, but as you remember that growth of the number of employees, what we have found is that every single time we doubled in size as a company, especially in R&D, we had to reinvent most of the ways of working and most of our structures and interfaces and interactions, because what was there before no longer worked and no longer scaled. So that has been one of the really hard and important lessons, is that you have to be ready to let go of some things. And we're going to come back to that soon. So just for those of you who maybe don't have a reference point to how Spotify works and how we're organized, we are like basic cell of our company are called squads, and they're fairly stable cross-functional teams that will have all of the engineering disciplines that are required, mobile backend, web, whatever. They'll have the machine learning support if that's required, the data analysts, they'll have the user researchers, they will have the designers, they will have a dedicated product manager or a product owner, as we used to call them, and they will have a dedicated engineering manager. So that's really the atomic unit of the organization. And what is interesting is that's also where all of our code, everything that we build and own, it's owned by a unit. We don't have any ownership at an individual level or at any higher level. So this group of 6 to 8 people is what tends to own all of the things that we build. And as such, people in that group have full responsibility end to end through entire life cycle of that piece of software, from inception, designing it, implementing it, running it, to killing it and deprecating and removing it and doing on-call. what is interesting is that that unit is usually where people own their own ways of working. So if you look at, I don't know, we have probably about 200 or so of these squads by now, maybe 300 even. Each one of them functions in a slightly different way. So we actually have like deliberately really high diversity. It's probably a bit of a stretch to use that metaphor, but you can think a little bit of these squads as indeed cells is an organism, that each of those cells is specialized with something that is needed for the company, but functions fairly independently on its own. But of course, like these squads on their own, they're fairly small. So sometimes they are not able to actually fully independently achieve the goals. And we put those squads together in what we call tribes. And that's another thing that was introduced in that paper that we still do very much. So we put together, similar cells into an organ, if you like, if we continue the biology analogy. And this is where like most of our leadership work happens. So this is where we have the most influential leaders, where we set strategies, direction, culture, where we have coaching, and where we really try to together pull product, tech, design, data insights, machine learning, all these important disciplines that come together to build our product. The paper mentions, chapters. Oh, no, wrong way, too quickly. And actually, this is something we've dropped since the paper was published. So it's like one of many, but quite significant changes. I've seen lots of companies still having chapters, and that was just a model of matrixed support in the organization that did not scale to our size. And today we have engineering managers, as you've seen in the previous picture. Jonathan mentioned guilds, and guilds very much are still part of Spotify culture and DNA, and we have them as communities of practice across the company. But again, what has happened is most of these guilds have really fragmented. So something like the web or the backend guild that used to be a single entity in Stockholm is now probably 10 different entities locally across the organization that sometimes tend to coordinate, sometimes not. There's also a bunch of informal guilds, which is very nice because it really creates a sense of community. But what we continue to do, very much like yourself, so look forward to the future for many more of Outbrain IOs. We tend to bring all of our engineering together into the same room once a year for a face-to-face meeting of everyone who works in R&D, so that we can really focus on inspiration, knowledge sharing, and like inspiring everyone or sharing the right solutions or the ideas that existed or were discovered throughout the year across the company. And of course, recently we've been doing this virtually, but everyone is really looking forward to do it face-to-face again, maybe next year. And then finally, when you look at the R&D across Spotify, and that's also a change that has happened after the IPO. We used to have a single R&D organization with a single leadership team that looked after all of R&D and all of technology. But today, the technology product design with the machine learning, data science, data insights, user experience folks, operations, agile coaches are no longer in a single organization, but are distributed across the big Spotify business units and function more independently. And that's also something to consider, like as a model that has really worked for us, because that centralized R&D function stopped being effective at some point. And as a result, for example, we have no CTO at Spotify. I'll mention later what we've done instead. So really what I tend to encourage people is to consider an organization, and definitely an organization like ourselves as a little bit of a fractal organization. There's like, depending on different levels, like you see similar structures, you'll see different leadership structures that are self-similar, but more importantly, just like in a fractal, every single piece that you zoom into is very unique. And I think that is something that has proven for us to be really successful and important as we grow, is that we have a high level of diversity in terms of how we work and how we look across the organization. And that creates something which turns out to be a high level of resilience, right? So because different teams look differently and maybe sometimes operate slightly differently, it allows us to find and see which ones operate well and amplify that, and see which ones don't operate so well, and then maybe change their ways of working. So at this point, I want to pull a little bit from architecture and like the real building architecture rather than software architecture. And I hope this is something that you do also in your organization. I have found over the years that inspiration for how to build and grow software organizations comes from many disciplines. And certainly architecture felt an important inspiration for me. I also love reading, and may sound a little bit grim, but all the nautical accidents and airspace accidents, because there's a lot to be learned there about usually how not to do leadership. So today we're going to look a little bit about one lesson from architecture. There's this fantastic book called How Buildings Learn, which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive because we tend to think of buildings as something that is very stable, that gets built and is done. But Stuart Brandt in this book kind of tells a different story and helps us see like how actually buildings evolve all the time. And I want to use this model that he presents there, very simple, pretty trivial, obvious, right? That there are many different levels or many different layers of change that exist, even in something like a solid building. And of course, the same sort of layers of change exist in organizations, right? So there's something that is fairly stable, like for a building, that's the site, that's where it's been built. That really doesn't change, although there's been buildings that have been moved from site to site. That also happens. And then there is structure that, maybe gets changed every 50 years. But there's a skin, like the facade, that maybe gets repainted every 5 years. And then there's, a service plan, like how the rooms are laid out, that maybe changes every 3 years. And then all the chairs and tables that change every day. And so if you think about that model, you have to think about the organization and think about like, what are the elements that are stable and should remain stable? And what are the elements that can be flexible and should be flexible? And I think the big learning for me and experience working at Spotify all of this time has been that way more than you would assume on the face has been changing. So we've really embraced this idea of continuous learning as an organization and continuous experimentation and change. And again, I'll be back to this. But if we use this model, what I want to show you is what are the elements that I would consider the structure or the site that change the least and that provide this continuity of direction. And of course, they are apart from the product vision. For me, two things: the principles that underpin the organization and the technology or our approach to technology and the technology we use. And this technology part is something that, for example, wasn't at all mentioned in that Spotify model paper, but I believe is really critical to how we develop. So in terms of principles, people tend to call that culture and say, like, what's your company culture? But I think when you ask Daniel, who's the CEO of Spotify right now, what he thinks about culture and what should we do to keep our culture, Daniel usually says, it's impossible to keep the culture. The culture is the sum of all the people and their behaviors, and the people constantly change. So we shouldn't worry about keeping the culture. What we should worry about is that we have a set of principles that guide us and shape the actual, current culture. And so there's a little comment here from Anders on that model, which was that all the things that we have in the organization, the team structure, the culture, the technical architecture, the platform, the product, and the workspace, like the physical building in which we are, all these things really align together and change at different pace, but are in sync with each other. So what are these principles? So I think one of the principles that Daniel repeats over and over again is that we should, as an organization, aim to make mistakes faster than anyone else. And some people go like, well, is that an encouragement to be sloppy and just do poor work? And of course it is not. It is an acknowledgement and understanding that we live in the volatile, uncertain world where things change much faster than we can predict, that actually predicting the future is impossible. And the only thing we can do is be really fast to react to it. And that requires a lot of experimentation. And experimentation done right is leading to some of these experiments failing. And these are the mistakes that Daniel talks about. So we really optimize our organization in such a way that we can make these mistakes as quickly as possible, so that we can increase or maximize our rate of learning. And that's not just learning about the product. I think that's super important. Not just learning about the features that work in the market, but also learning about the structure of the organization, the skills that we need, the sizes of the org, the locations where we are, or even how our offices are built, I think the office in which I am usually based has been refurbished at least 3 times since I started. And so for all of you who I'm sure kind of been based in the Agile Manifesto mindset, this notion of regular intervals at which we reflect and inspect and adapt is something that hopefully is part of your DNA. It's definitely part of our DNA. There's also, if you want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into those principles, I encourage you to read our band manifesto. It's publicly available on the website. There's the address. I'll share the link, the slides with you later, so you can refer back to it. But our chief HR officer calls this controlled chaos. And certainly it can feel like this a lot of the time, but this is something that we believe makes us successful. So, just to summarize my reflection of the guiding principles, and I'm going to mention a few more things here. So there's something we call psychological safety that we got inspired by Google's research, which is really about making sure that Spotify as a company becomes a community of people who feel safe and well working with each other. So, in one dimension, you can imagine that building the organization and continuing to build the organization is about building a great community where all of you want to belong and want to be part of it. And of course, that community is there to be focused on the customer, to be able to fulfill the needs and get the jobs to be done for the customers with our application. And hopefully this is how we continue to deliver a product that many of our users love. We believe that the best way to deliver this product and with the customer focus is to have aligned autonomy, which means that we give as much autonomy to our teams as possible. That is super important, that people feel like they have the agency, they can influence the future. That we experiment all the time, that we have very much participatory environment, that everyone has a voice. And something that, again, is important for people to be included is transparency. And finally, something that I've heard in the Q&A in the previous talk, which I, very strongly +1, this notion of having diversity and continuously increasing diversity in our organizations in terms of everything, genders, cultures, languages, but also education. All of that matters greatly for building the great product. And that diversity requires creating also an atmosphere of belonging. So it's not enough to just bring, a bunch of people who are different from ourselves, but we also have to make sure that they feel welcome and that they want to stay and want to continue working with us. So I think that's also something that has been a very deliberate and big investment on our part in the last few years, and definitely accelerated since the IPO. And we still have a long way to go. So I think if you're maybe a little bit earlier in your growth path, it's really worth investing a lot in bringing as diverse workforce as possible, and also making sure that that diversity is represented at the leadership levels, not just in the teams and the people who do the work. And then I mentioned that technology is something that really underpins what we have. And so first of all, we have part of our organization, about probably 500 people by now, building the Spotify platform. This is their logo. And they're there to enable Spotify to build with speed at scale safely. That's a very catchy name, but it's really what they do is support all the engineering community with building awesome tools and taking away all this repetitive work that can be automated, so that the engineer's experience is as good as it can be. and they have as few friction points as possible. And this is something that, I know that you've been investing in, and I would encourage you to continue investing in, because it is super, super important. Many organizations that I talk to are usually surprised by the level of investment that the company does in their own infrastructure and their own tooling. And it's not just about, building everything in-house yourself, sometimes using great open source software, but having someone who really looks after that all the time. And so just to give you a flavor of this, that organization now consists of 8 different tribes that look after not just productivity of engineers or how we build our mobile platform, but also about the different constituencies. For example, how our data insights folks are supported, how our machine learning infrastructure is created, how our designers and user experience folks are supported with a design platform of shared components that can be used and applied in different places. So then, what does it look like in practice? This is going to be super, hopefully familiar for you, and maybe even similar to how you experience this today. Whenever today, like everything for an engineer happens in GitHub, if you do a pull request, like this one, I pulled from one of the teams I worked with, here's a Victor putting a pull request, here's Marcus approving it, and basically some of the automation that creates the build and deploys that. So basically everything that happens with your software lifecycle lives in GitHub when it's related to any software changes. So basically you don't have to leave GitHub. That's the only page you really need to look at to get from your desktop, from the code, through the tests, through to deployment. And I mentioned something, and Jonathan already alluded to this tool called Backstage here. I'll show you also a few pictures from Backstage. And this is, again, just to give you a flavor of how far we've taken that tool. And I'm going to show you like 1% of what is there. But so this is the front page of our Backstage. A little bit like your tool, search is definitely the central part of it. And there's a bunch of tools. You can see the toolbox here. And you've just seen a picture of a pull request from a team from a system called, I think it was Play. And so that system has its front page where you can get all the information, who's the owner, who you get in touch, how they're like, what is the quality of the code, what is some metadata, what are the dependencies, and a bunch of, in the menu on the left, like lots of operational stuff. I just want to show you one aspect of that operational stuff, which is, of course, we, like I'm sure you do as well, run everything in containers using Kubernetes. We happen to use the Google Cloud, so you can see all the deployments to all the pods, all the Kubernetes pods of your software, how many there are, all the history of versions that you can, of course, deploy with a single click of a button, and any of the engineers can do it. And that's standard today, but for many organizations, it's still not reality. And then, of course, we do things like, for example, A/B testing. I'm sure you do that a lot, and that's also integrated into Backstage. So I found here like an old test that we finished, where actually, you just make the change and you mark in the code the 2 variants of your A/B test that you're interested in, and basically the system decides how to build exposure to that piece of code, how to show it in front of new users or existing users, calculates a bunch of metrics, success metrics, and then even at the end tells you, okay, that test was successful or not, and we recommend or not recommend shipping it. And of course, back to Daniel's make mistakes faster than anyone else. Many of those A/B tests are actually, not recommended for, like they don't improve any of the metrics, so they're not shipped. So let's finish by talking about challenges and hearing your questions. So actually, I came up with 2 themes for challenges. One is entropy, which is the physics around us that applies to the organizations as well. So here's the definition from Wikipedia. And if you've paid attention at school to physics and the second law of thermodynamics, that the entropy only increases with time. So basically what it says is if we want to create an order in the system, we have to invest energy. And of course, that's one of the best illustrations of what entropy looks like in practice. Your tire will never inflate itself. It will only deflate itself. And that actually really applies to engineering. And we have really taken that to heart in a sense that our code will deteriorate itself. That entropy applies to code as well, and especially this is real graph from our from Backstage actually that shows you the number of engineers that we've hired over time and the number of components they've built over time. So you can see that actually we have no hope of keeping up with the exponential growth of software that we built. And so there's absolutely only one solution to this problem, especially if you look at something like this. So that was the number of components. This is a part of the network of our microsystems backend infrastructure. So every single dot you see here is a backend service that is deployed in production for Spotify, and every single line is a dependency between those two. So of course, this goes to the level of complexity that is unmanageable by humans. And so that is our only future and our only ability to go forward and really manage this. And then we think about this, inspired by Google. So this is not from Spotify. This is a picture from Google that showed the number of human commits in the repositories and automated commits. So this is very much what we believe is the future. And this is very much what we invest in at Spotify, and still a long way to go. But that requires a level of consistency and, clear APIs and clear standards that people follow, because otherwise, the automation cannot happen. But here's a little example of what already happens. The same system that I actually showed you before, play. Here's a bump of the probably root POM here in the Java system that is initiated by a dependency bot that is approved by the dependency bot and is merged by Fleet Manager bot and then built successfully and deployed without any interaction with the engineers. So they don't even know that this happened unless they went back to GitHub and looked at the merged pull requests. So this is something we're starting on, but we believe that without this, we will not be able to scale and grow in the way that we believe we need to. And the other aspect of how the company struggles or challenges we have is the flow. And I found this interesting quote from a book from a few years ago that tried to actually describe what Spotify is like. So the author said that Spotify, instead of being one massive ocean liner winding its way through a series of functions, Spotify's workflow looks more like a regatta of speedboats heading in the same general direction. I started at Spotify seeing those speedboats going in all sorts of directions. But as we grew, it became slower and slower, and those two directions became more and more limited. So, our way forward looks like this. We have to, like, the ocean has frozen a little bit, and we need to find those icebreakers that will continue to create the path for these speedboats to continue exploring. And that's what comes with growth, and that's what, again, we are exploring, and our icebreakers are creating a lot of transparency around our strategies and direction, but also creating alignment. I told you that we don't have a CTO at Spotify, and instead we have a group of engineering leaders called XTL, Cross Technology Leadership. And they are trying to create those channels in the ice so that the teams can go in the right direction. And we also invested heavily in a network of tech steering groups where our more senior engineers get together and help guide all of the other teams in creating the right architectural decisions in the right direction. And finally, when we think about this flow and enabling this flow, this is from a blog post from literally a couple of days ago from Jessica Kerr, but I pulled it out because it really represents how we think. So when different parts of an organization need to coordinate, it seems like a good idea to help them coordinate smoothly and frequently. Don't. Help them coordinate less, more explicitly and less often. And this is like the effect of building our microservices architecture. It's about keep those microservices decoupled. And instead of coordinating how we build them, create clear, explicit APIs and contracts, and have good boundaries on each side of the contracts, because otherwise you're going to turn back into an ocean liner. So, a few words of wisdom, these are quotes that really resonated with me, and I know resonate with a lot of people at Spotify. So hopefully will resonate with you as well. If you only do things where you know the answer in advance, your company goes away. So keep experimenting. Things become better when we accept them as they are, not as we want them to be. So really work with our reality. And whatever you think you can or you can't do, you're right. So much as I don't agree with a lot of thinking, especially around leadership with Henry Ford, with this one thing, I totally agree. It's about growth mindset. And that's all really I had to share. Probably eaten most of our time, but hopefully there will be time for questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcin. We'll do now the Q&A. So let's start with Zoom. People from remote, Ljubljana, people at Zoom, feel free to just unmute and ask. Okay.
Anything controversial there, like anything that you felt like was outrageous, this will never work, or how does that work for Spotify?
So we talked in the past, but I didn't tell you how much I love killing tech debt. The team here knows that, but I would like to know your perspective on that and how you do that.
I mean, okay, so I will tell you this. If you find a solution to continually addressing tech debt, you'll be a very rich person, because I think that's like every single company that I know has struggled with that. And of course, I mean, there's a, like, I would say threefold solution, that at least the way we try to think about this. And of course, it goes back to entropy. Exactly. Addressing continually tech debt is about dealing with that entropy and counteracting it. And it's, first of all, it's about having the really disciplined practice of small step improvements with every single thing you do. And, I know that, we have some super bright engineers at Spotify, and I know they still, look at me weird when I say, like, with every single change you make, you can improve the system. And they go like, no, we have to take, 3 months out to do a big refactoring. And it's like this skill of being able to improve your system over time significantly through only small steps is something that I think is underrated, and we should invest way more into it. The other one is, well, we just have to have time to pay back some of that tech debt, and be very deliberate about this. And finally, like, find the ways in which the infrastructure can help you. And, one of the, some of the things that around tech debt is like, okay, if we don't upgrade dependent libraries, at some point they introduce breaking change. And if we're too far behind, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of tech debt. So if you can automate those things, like we're trying to do now, these are less surprising.
Okay, I think that answers that in a way. More or questions here? I will be happy. Ori.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. So you have those speedboats that are running in the same direction. So first of all, there should be some guiding light that will guide those speedboats to the same direction. And second of all, a lot of decisions are being made on those small groups that are executing all the time. And execution is taking a lot of decisions. Now, decisions have consequences. Consequences are sometimes affecting other ships or other boats, and the wake that they are making in the water start interfering each other. How do you make sure that when a decision is being made, all the context for the consequences of a decision is being delivered to people making the decision, or you don't?
Yeah.
Just let them fail.
Yeah, exactly. Great question. So first of all, I think most of the time we don't, but what we try to do, and this is, I know Amazon does this the same, and they talk a lot about type 1 and type 2 decisions, which is decisions which are reversible and decisions which are not reversible easily. So for all the reversible decisions, we just don't care. And what we try to do is we try to teach our leaders, and that this is actually, I would say, almost the only job of our engineering leaders and product leaders is to identify when those decisions that are harder to reverse or irreversible are happening, and provide the right context for those decisions to be made. So I'd say like this is the TSGs is one example structure that we're trying to employ here. A lot of coordination forums. That's like basically, as a leader at Spotify, your main job is to look out for these things happening and elevating them to the right forum so that they can be discussed with the impacted parties. But mostly we really put a lot of effort to make sure that they are isolated as much as possible, so that those waves don't crush over other boats. So really by decoupling.
Cool. More questions from Zoom, Ljubljana.
I see one. I mean, there's one question in the chat, so maybe we can take that. Dan is asking, what is the onboarding process for new employees? And I would say, I'd say the onboarding process is one of the very important parts of how we bring people into the company and how do we help them be successful. And I would say that our onboarding process takes about 6 months. That's like the extent of different activities that happened when you're starting at Spotify. And it starts with a boot camp. So your first 2 weeks is actually getting together with new people who joined Spotify around the same time and actually trying to build something together. And after you've built something together and kind of got a flavor for our technology and how to collaborate, and during this time of building something, you also get a bunch of presentations where you learn a little bit more about our ways of working, our culture. That's one. Another, I think, critical part of onboarding, which usually happens in your first 3 months, is that every single new employee comes together at something we call intro days, which is 3 days that the new employees spend with the board and with all the the top leadership team of Spotify. So all of our CX folks come and meet with all of those new employees and tell them their vision and their story and try to align them in that way early on onto how to think about Spotify and which way we're going.
Cool. Sounds very interesting, I would say.
I mean, it's a huge investment also from the teams, from the leadership team, of course, but we believe it pays off because people have a much better understanding of what we're trying to achieve and how. Okay,
more questions on chat?
Okay, Tal says, you mentioned to experiment a lot. When so many people experiment with a B2C product, how do you control these experiments without getting chaos? So frankly, to some extent, probably the Spotify experience is a little bit chaotic for our customers. But I would say, I mean, we have an incredible advantage, and I think something that is maybe a little bit hard to reproduce, the fact, like the size of our user base. So that allows us to run, hundreds and hundreds of experiments at the same time, while only affecting a small part of the population. But also, I showed you a single experiment that is being run in Backstage, how you could see it. But there's a lot of logic behind how we set up the experiments in terms of the control groups. So we're really making sure that no single user of Spotify is exposed to too many A/B tests at the same time. And that's obviously done all in the backend in a database. So that's really how we're trying to maximize keep fairly consistent experience for our customers to the extent that we can. but yeah, the fact that we have a lot of customers with whom we can experiment, and the fact, of course, that many of these experiments, like there's also a bunch of experiments that just happen in a lab, right? With paper prototypes, with user research. That's a super important part of our work. So it's not that every single idea is first tested on the live product. And frankly, a very big part of our new features are tested on the employees first. So that's also our advantage.
Yeah, I think that also answer a third question from the Slack about how do you meet the customer. So we are a B2B2C company. You are a B2C.
Yeah.
So your customers are mainly, I believe, your subscribers.
Yes.
So you meet them either through directly as employees or with A/B tests or something like that.
So we have a bunch of user testing labs, and we run a lot of user testing. And first, of course, we invite our development teams to participate or at least watch some of those. Many of these are recorded and are shared internally as well so that people can see it. But frankly, one of the good sources of getting in touch with our customers, maybe not directly, but indirectly, is looking at Reddit as well and Twitter. And we actually engage with those communities, maybe passively a little bit, but we read a lot of that input and react to it internally, even maybe if it doesn't always look like this outside.
Okay, another question from Slack. How can you manage and have a wide overview on fractal structure?
I'm sorry, on what?
On the fractal structure.
We don't, and we don't try to. I mean, that's one of the things that we've learned. Like there is very little centralization at Spotify. And it's very hard to know exactly what everyone is working at any one point in time. And we believe that's okay. I mean, it feels, and for many people, and still even for people who are at Spotify, sometimes it feels scary. And it feels like, we have no control over what's going on in this huge company. And it sometimes feels like this. But because it produces the right outcomes over and over again, we're fine with it. But yeah, no, I mean, there's no, for example, there's no centralized system that governs all the work that we do, or there's no single repository. Like GitHub, of course, has all the code, but all the work tracking happens independently, and many teams have their own systems and tools that don't integrate with each other. But of course, we have layers of visions and strategy that create this coordination. So it's about input, right, and not about controlling the outputs.
Okay, and last question, I hope I can read it. How do you deal with teams growing more than 8 members?
Good question. It's very organic. So first of all, there are teams that can actually still function effectively when they're a bit bigger. I would say probably 12. I've definitely seen teams like as big. But what happens in practice is, again, back to this biological metaphor, the cell just splits. So, in my organization, when I was a tribe lead, I think I started with about 6 teams, and then we ended up with 9 teams, just because the teams grew and they found ways in which they could split the ownership and the direction of the team or the mission for the team. So that happens quite a lot, and that's actually initiated very much by the teams. So the teams go like, we're too big. We're going to split like this. Give us some input into what useful direction of that split would be.
Okay, and I think that summarizes the entire session. So thank you, Marcin, very much for a great talk and for being our keynote for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you all. I hope this was useful and valuable. Please don't hesitate to reach out on LinkedIn if you have any more questions, and have a great day. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It's been a privilege.